Bonsoir à tous.
Well, good evening, everybody. So there's nearly 140 of us connected to talk together about this very important subject, and a subject which is really very important to museum professionals. Good evening, everybody. Good evening in particular to Charles Personnaz, the director of the French Heritage Institute, who'll be speaking in just a few moments. And we work with them to organize these debate evenings and have been working together to do that for nearly 3 years now. This is our 9th debate evening where we focus on ethics because we are working on topics that are linked into the ethics of museum professionals, and we have this same format. We spend 3 hours together at the end of the day for people working in French time, at another time for people abroad, of course. And if people can't be with us now, they can catch up with the recording later on, and these events are very quickly put online. The events are interpreted into the 3 official languages of ICOM, and then we also publish the proceedings of these events afterwards in writing. So we're here together just for a short period, but it's also a period that lasts together. Thank you, Charles Personnaz, for this evening that we're working on really together. It's really a collaborative effort. We prepare everything together. I'm going to hand over for you to say something, Anne-Claude, about translation, and then we can start the debate. Sorry, over to Charles Personnaz. So, thank you, and yes, just this first presentation from me before you speak again. Of course, I'd like to introduce this on a number of areas, but first of all, because I can see the statistics at the bottom of the screen that is rising significantly. This is an important event. There's a good number of people following us today. I think that this evening's theme is really at the very heart of what we are about and is at the heart of society today in France and abroad, and we're all faced with this particular issue. So I wanted to thank you, dear Juliette, for the way that we prepare these evenings together, the way that the INP and ICOM teams work together. The INP teams really enjoy this. Thank you for the whole team, and in particular Hélène Vessal, who's been the link between our 2 institutions, ICOM and INP, the French Heritage Institute. I'll come back to this question of sustainable development. It's an essential question, of course, for us, because I think heritage is at the heart of this question of sustainable development, even if it hasn't been presented in that way up to now, because the impetus for sustainable development is not coming from our cultural domain, but we can see the way that we have fed into this, contributed to it through adding social aspects, economic aspects, and we are really at the heart of this question. I've said a number of times, and some of you might remember this, that the French Heritage Institute should have for its motto, preserving and passing on. Preserving and passing on, and this is what we're all about. This is what all cultural and heritage professionals are all about. This is in its very essence a motto that applies to sustainable development. We can see consensus and coherence between the objectives of sustainable development and passing on heritage. In France, perhaps more than in other countries, we have had a separation between natural heritage and cultural heritage with two different legal systems that function in parallel. And this may be why this question of sustainable development may have seemed uh, peripheral, on the edge of our cultural work, while actually sustainable development is at the heart of what we do. I think that we are now moving towards a time when these two approaches are coming together, and I can see that through the international cooperation that we're involved in, we're seeing this everywhere, and that there is a global and a general desire to treat heritage, not just cultural heritage, but also natural and social heritage. We are engaged in this work because a training institute cannot remain separate from these crucial issues for our society. And we've been engaged in a number of different ways. First of all, uh, preparing and training those who are going to preserve heritage that is in itself a sustainable development practice, because when you're preserving professions and passing these professions on to others, then you are already part of this approach. So it's totally natural for our institution to be focused on these questions. And I'm just coming back to the IMP French Heritage Institute there. The questions that we have faced have been to do with heritage and risk, heritage and climate crises, safeguarding common, how to work in the issues we're facing linked to climate change. And there is also the high number of visitors in our sites, and so this is impacting heritage. We need to approach these different environmental issues that we are facing, and we've changed our focus with a seminar that we are developing this year together with the Louvre, focused on the heritage of sustainable development as a public concern. And this is something that's going to be very uh, full, very rich, and I encourage you to follow and engage with this conference. We're going to try and develop a number of concrete actions that would help us to move forward with our different functions in order to coordinate their functions. This conference with the Louvre is also encouraging us to think about eco-responsibility, and was taking us from a broad thinking approach to very practical solutions in terms of continuous training. We want to encourage various restorers and other roles, other professional roles. We want to help them to engage with sustainable development, whether this is for restoration work that uses solvents that are as harmless as possible and maintain the health of the works and the environment. We work, of course, as Hélène Vessal is responsible for this. We work on this theme of the eco-design of exhibitions with programs that are really very popular and is leading us to develop our work in terms of continuous and continuing training. all of this work linked to the initial training of curators and conservators is we don't often talk about this, but we develop these professions for the scientific and natural heritage as well, and we want the state to engage with that area more fully. And this could be a response to some of these questions. I don't want to go into all the details, but what I'm trying to do is just to help you understand how this area of sustainable development is important to museums, but also to the French Heritage Institute. We're going to have a remarkable panel of experts this evening, and thank you to all of them for being here. They're going to help us to study all the different aspects of this question and consider whether museums can make a credible contribution to sustainable development. And of course, the answer is yes. And what we're interested in finding out is how can they do this? That's what we're going to be focused on tonight. Because of course, museums are institutions that are engaged in time, engaged in their local areas, engaged with people, and connected into this question of sustainable development. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Charles Personnaz. Thank you for your introductory remarks, because they place this evening's debate in that spirit that we together wanted to give it. We wanted to have a forward-looking and a concrete approach. Forward-looking because together we're going to try and design the museum we want for tomorrow, a more virtuous and museum that's ever more aware of its place in society. ICOM was created 75 years ago at the end of the Second World War because museums were convinced that coming together they could work for sustained peace. They were convinced that museums could do this, not because their professionals were more extraordinary than others, but because this is their very mission, as Charles has reminded us, preserving the traces of history, nature, and the arts so that the memory of mankind and knowledge could enlighten the future. This is what we need today. The world is in turmoil with this wickedly long-lasting pandemic and repeated climate disasters. No one today doubts how important it is to act urgently. Museums have nothing to do with contributing to these problems, but they can do something about it. A researcher, Robert James, recently published in Museums in Perilous Times, he says, in addition to their deep view of time, museums are eminently qualified to address climate change for a variety of reasons. They are grounded in their communities and are expressions of locality. They are a bridge between science and culture. They bear witness by assembling evidence and knowledge and making things known. They are seed banks of sustainable living practices that have guided our species for millennia. They are skilled at making learning accessible, engaging, and fun. And last, they are some of the most free and creative work environments in the world. Dear Charles, you have this responsibility for training professionals who are going to preserve and maintain and pass on this heritage. You have this responsibility to help them understand that they're going to have to change their way of working for those already who have experience in working, and for younger people to help them change their idea, to help them think about sustainability. This is something that is surprising, but is not something that is beyond us. Concretely and specifically, museums are productivist and certainly more and more competitive, for better or worse. The positive side of this is the attractive offering that museums have developed, but the problem with that is that this attractiveness is largely based on the opposite of sustainability, with the turnover of projects and objects. We've known for a long time, and we've been working on this. A journalist tried last week to help me, to make me say that museums were a bit behind in this area. But I don't think that's true. I think we are eco-responsible players. We know that this question of sustainable development is not limited to climate and ecology. That is what is at stake in tonight's debate. We want to talk about the future of our vision and the bridge that we play, the bridge that we are between science and culture. ICOM France has been working for some time with our 5,600 members, bringing together, drawing lessons from them, and from these lessons, developing methodologies, guides, or charters that can then be distributed in a way that is accessible to all. In concrete terms, professionals have accumulated know-how, eco-responsible know-how about materials, building and transport over the last few years, and they want to talk about it and share it. That's why they're here tonight. And you, our guests today, are here to talk about and share your thoughts and ideas and experience. And we hope you'll do that in the chat. We are orchestrators of these good practices, and that's what we want to do this evening. But museums are lacking reliable tools for measuring their activities with rules and standards that are up to date. And this is something that we could put in place. And we're looking forward to hearing from our guest from the Ministry of Culture to talk about how we develop these things. That's not going to be an easy task. Museums are well aware they have their part to play in setting an example. They know they have a considerable responsibility. They are recognized, and this was featured in a G20 declaration. They're recognized as one of the most credible institutions. That's why we gave tonight's debate the title it has. Museums are the repositories of our fellow citizens' trust. We believe in what they're seeing in museums. There is work to be done. Museums are all about the experience of museums and beyond museums. It doesn't stop at just the museum itself. Museums help people to think, they awaken the conscience. And perhaps this is something we need to be aware of when we think about museums with regard to other institutions. Some people enjoy museums, but it's not a distraction. It's not a diversion. We are looking now to think about the best way to define the word museum, and we're going to vote for that at our General Assembly. The definition of museum, ICOM definitions of museum, is an important thing, and I think the most important word we could associate with museums is emotions, not distractions or entertainment, but emotion. This might be difficult to understand these specific French terms. It might be difficult for our non-French speaking friends to follow this, but I want to talk about translation here because the challenge of sustainable development has no boundaries. It applies to us all. We all face these same risks and we don't experience it in the same way, but we all need to speak the same language. Or at least we need to speak with the same voice, but that's something that's complicated. because in order to think deeply and build innovative concepts, we need to be able to use our own language with the richness of their expressions, of our language's expressions, which is not possible when we only have one language of communication. With everyone speaking in their own language and speaking the same language, that's what translation can do. And that's why, along with many colleagues, we're calling for it to be used more systematically in the same way as we're doing this evening. We want to hear your vision of museums and how we can make a credible contribution to a sustainably developed society. Each collection has much to teach us about the art of enduring, of overcoming adversity, of inventing new ways of living in society, of preserving nature and of warning about its threats. Our museums contain testimonies of memory and science, art and history. Each collection has something to make its visitors aware of sustainable development in the noblest sense of this term. And we saw this with the Orsay exhibition a few weeks ago, and we'll talk about that a little bit this evening. This exhibition about the origins of the world, the invention of nature in the 19th century, or with our German friends at Karlsruhe with their exhibition called Vital, or in the future there'll be the exhibition at the Fine Arts Museum of Leidl on environmental injustices and indigenous alternatives, which we'll hear about this evening from our friend in Switzerland. Just to mention a few of these examples, we hope that many of you will be able to engage in our discussion this evening to talk about the projects that are being prepared in your establishments. And we hope that some of you in 3 or 4 years, you'll be opening exhibitions linked into this theme. And we hope that out of this evening, people will go back to their museum with the conviction that they have to ask this question: how can we in our museum with our collections, whether it's an art museum, science museum, history museum, how can we talk about sustainable development and raise the awareness of our visitors around these areas? I think it's really encouraging that there's a real energy in our profession. There are so many working groups, so many volunteers, 50,000 around the world, and working with ICOM, and we've been growing for 3/4 of a century. This is a force that I can only invite our decision makers and governors throughout the world to respect and mobilize, because ICOM is at the forefront of this issue of sustainable development. That's it from me. Thank you, all of you, to being with us. I'm going to hand over now to our moderators this evening who've agreed to orchestrate this debate with our different speakers. Hélène Vessel has already been mentioned by Charles Personnaz. She's part of the board of ICOM. She's our secretary. And then there is Estelle Guildebut, who is the treasurer of ICOM France and works with the French Ministry of Culture. And after each speaker speaks, they will be helping to encourage the debate. So over to you now, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Juliette. Thank you to all of you for your confidence. As Juliette was saying, the topic for tonight will hopefully give us a practical vision of sustainable development. As Juliette said, Estelle and myself will be moderating this evening's meeting. And as we were saying, we would very much welcome your questions in the chat box. So do ask questions of our guests tonight. And then with Juliette, we will have a collective conclusion at the end of the evening. I hope you'll still be around for that. There's already 277 people on with us, which is incredible. So I'm going to welcome Harry McGhie, who is Henry McGhie, who is a member of the Sustainable Development Commission at ICOM. He created the agency Curating Tomorrow. So we're going to hear him speak to us via a video that he has recorded. He's not been able to be here with us tonight, unfortunately, but he's going to speak to us now.
Hello, my name is Henry McGhie. I'm a museum consultant based in the UK, and I'm also a member of the ICOM Sustainability Working Group. And so I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes or so about museums and sustainable development and how I think they can be more credible and more capable. And so I'll talk mostly around the sustainable development goals, but try to give some background about what they are all about, because there's quite a lot of confusion about that. And so the way I work is I write a series of guides that you can get for free to help museums and their partners to get moving with sustainable development. So the one at the top left, Museums and the Sustainable Development Goals, I wrote in 2019, just ahead of the ICOM conference. Circulates very widely. It's on about 20,000 downloads now, which tells me that there is a lot of interest in this work, but there's still a long way to go. And the other guides that you can see there are all about different sustainable development topics. Mainstreaming the Sustainable Development Goals is about helping to plan and to move and to achieve greater results. Museums and Disaster Risk Reduction is about building resilience. And Museums and Human Rights is about using human rights as a basic for museum services to society. And so if we look at in 2019 in Kyoto at the big ICOM conference, the membership adopted two resolutions on sustainability. The first one I'll talk mostly about on sustainability and the implementation of Agenda 2030. And the other one, my colleague Karin, Weil, who's also here at the conference, will talk about. And so in the resolution, it says that we recognize that all museums have a role to play in shaping and creating a sustainable future through our various programs, partnerships and operations. And it also advised ICOM and its members to use the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs as we call them for short, and their targets as a basis for this sustainability action. And I've included two photographs on the bottom here to show why we need these Sustainable Development Goals. So the one on the bottom right is from the ICOM Kyoto conference when we presented this, how can museums support the Sustainable Development Goals. The image on the left is when the Kyoto Protocol was adopted in 1992. So a long time before. And that's kind of the problem that we have, is that because of, for whatever reason, action has just not been enough. Whether you can blame governments, but we might also ask whether the museum sector has been doing enough or knew how to do enough. The Sustainable Development Goals and targets help us move much, much faster. They're fantastic for that. And so I wanted to say a little bit about, well, what do we mean? The word sustainable and sustainability can be so overused that they become rather meaningless. It becomes very confusing when people say, is this sustainable? Is it more sustainable? It's a bit of a rabbit hole to go down. In the older sense, sustainable, if something was sustainable, it often meant it was less harmful. It was about stopping things going wrong, but really that's not enough. I far prefer to work with sustainable development, as we are in this conference. That sustainable development is different. It's about action. It's about focused activity to achieve a better balance of considerations of people, planet, and prosperity. So if the old sense, sustainability was about stopping things going wrong. Sustainable development is about helping them go right. It's a fantastic concept. And we can think that sustainability is the end goal. It's what we're trying to get towards. But sustainable development is the activity that helps us to get there. And so we might consider how sustainable development compares with how museums often operate. that in the old mindset, the growth mindset, whether it's economics, our buildings, our audiences, or budgets, there's often a drive for them to get bigger. So that's about getting quantitatively bigger. And that just doesn't work in a way because it can't last forever. Sustainable development, considering people, planet, and prosperity, is about getting qualitatively better, doing things better. And so the latest initiative that we have for sustainable development is called Agenda 2030. It follows on from the Millennium Development Goals, but it also follows on from a number of initiatives before that. So it was developed between 2012 and 2015 with a big consultation across society. And so that is actually very important because it means it has a mandate from society. It's not just about governments saying we want to do this or museums saying they want to do something. It's about society saying this is what we want to do. So it was adopted in 2015 by all the world's governments, and it's set out as a blueprint for sustainable development. So a focused programme of action to happen between 2015 and 2030 to help put the world on a pathway to a sustainable future. And I just show two images here. So the one on the right is the one that people are very often familiar with, the 17 goals, but they are only part of the picture. They are the results framework for this thing called Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda, which is a document which you can get online very easily. And it's really important. And it's even the goals don't actually make sense without reference to Transforming Our World. Please do have a look at it if you haven't already. And so the overall agenda includes, as I say, it's about more than the goals. It includes a declaration, a description of our world today with its many, many challenges, a vision of a better one, which is fantastic. It talks about the goals and targets, and then about the means of implementation, how the agenda will be achieved. It talks about the follow-up and review, so how it will be evaluated and reported on by countries. And it sets out a call for action to change the world, which is also excellent. And in line with the topic of your conference, how do I think museums can be credible or more credible? I think the first thing is to make sure that you're familiar with the contents of Transforming Our World. And also just ask yourself how you can contribute towards it, as it says in the Sustainability Resolution. And so, of course, I'm talking about the agenda, the overall agenda, and the 17 goals. It's often a bit too much to remember. There's a really great way to summarize what are the overarching aims of this agenda. And we call this the 5 Ps. It's shown here like a jigsaw because the bits have to fit together.
Ouais, franchement, c'est pas super intéressant. Je pense que le mieux, c'est d'aller faire des pattes.
Sustainable development, sustainability, people, planet, and prosperity. And it adds on to peace and partnership. There can be no sustainable development without peace and no peace without sustainable development. And partnership is how we achieve the whole thing. And so I'm just going to go through this because it is really important. So people. So we're determined to end poverty and hunger in all their forms and dimensions and ensure that all human beings can fulfill their potential in dignity and equality and in a healthy environment. Planet. We are determined to protect the planet from degradation. Prosperity. We are determined to ensure that all human beings can enjoy prosperous and fulfilling lives and that economic, social, and technological progress occurs in harmony with nature. Peace. We are determined to foster peaceful, just, and inclusive societies which are free from fear and violence. As I said before, there can be no sustainable development without peace, and no peace without sustainable development. And partnership. To build a revitalized global partnership for sustainable development based on the spirit of solidarity, focused in particular on the needs of the poorest and most vulnerable, and with the participation of all countries, all stakeholders, and all people. And we might just draw attention to the last line there about how museums...
Non, vous faites calme les enfants. Non. Est-ce que... Ah, ça marche pas à cause de l'appel de papa.
So I think to be credible, museums and ICOM France and the whole of ICOM needs to be committed to these overarching goals. They are the goals of the agenda.
Emmène-moi la télécommande.
So I would say that there's a common mistake is made with the goals that people try to line up what they're doing.
Continuez là.
Appuie. The point is to help achieve them, is to help, to build this better world and address all of the goals. And so, as I mentioned, I write these guides, and in this one, Museums and the Sustainable Development Goals, what I did was think, well, there are 17 goals, 169 targets. What are the things that museums do and how can they contribute to these goals and targets? And I got that down to a framework of what I call these 7 key activities about how museums collect and care for cultural and natural heritage, how they're concerned about it in the wider world, how they support people's education to know and be able to act as part of sustainable development, how they enable people to take part in cultural life, which is a basic human right, how they support responsible and sustainable tourism, because otherwise it's a huge generator of greenhouse gas emissions, how they support research that contributes to a sustainable future, making sure all of their everyday decisions contribute to a better future, and working with others, other partnerships and collaborations to lever their potential to create a better world. And so, just to summarize, contributing to Agenda 2030 and the goals really helps to fulfill museums' responsibilities to society. It ensures that people can exercise their basic human rights through museums, whether that's the right to education, to participate in cultural life, to take part in public affairs, or any other human rights. It helps them contribute to a better future where museums themselves are actually more likely to thrive. It helps museums build partnerships and achieve greater results than they can achieve on their own. It helps museums demonstrate their relevance and impact. And at the end of the day, I think it's just the right thing to do. And if we think about what are the particular opportunities that ICOM France has, ICOM France can help build partnerships between all of the French-speaking countries of the world. It can help ensure that their voices are heard in the global museum discussion. And it can also help connect the great inequality that we see between the global north and the global south, where we need much greater ambition and action in the global north to ensure that the global south doesn't suffer from the consequences of climate change. And so I wish you a very successful conference, and thank you for your attention.
Merci infiniment, Henry.
Thank you very much, Henry. We're now going to welcome Karin Weil. She's an anthropologist and a museum professional. She's with us tonight. I want to thank her for being with us. She's responsible for the work at the Museum of Kusnt in Chile. I'm asking her to talk about her vision, and I'm quoting here, her vision of a sustainable museology. Welcome, Karin. I'm going to hand over to you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we can't hear. The microphone is shut. Your microphone is off.
Ahí sí. ¿Ahora sí?
Sí, sí,
ahora sí.
Sí.
Perdón. Buenas noches.
Okay, I'm sorry about that.
Muchas gracias por la invitación. Espero poder compartir en este breve.
Thank you for the invitation. I hope to be able to share with you, but if you have some questions or want to share any information, I'd really love to exchange with you and hear from you in the name of ICOM Chile. I'd like to talk about these different experiences that I've been able to work on. So if I could have the next slide, please. Next slide, please. In 2015, we adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, and the result of this was to develop a better balance between people, planet, and prosperity. So it's really important to remember that we shouldn't just talk about the 17 goals, but also think about where they come from. The goal is sustainable and equal development for all peoples of the world and all ecosystems. And so we want to contribute in a constructive way to sustainable development. So ICOM created a working group in 2018, and its mission is to assist ICOM in determining how to integrate sustainability both within ICOM and among its individual members and institutions. We should remember that ICOM has over 55,000 members around the world, representing 130 different countries. We have the opportunity to work with different institutions, and we can see the reality of all the people in the different regions. Next slide, please. So at the ICOM General Conference in 2019, 5 resolutions were adopted. And these were focused on the commitment of museums to sustainability and their contribution to the achievement of the goals associated with sustainable development. The first resolution was to do with sustainability and the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. The third resolution was about the commitment to the concept of museums as cultural hubs, and Resolution 5 was defined on the basis of work between 2 regions working together, of experience from Latin America focused on museum communities and sustainability. Can I have the next slide, please?
Next one, next diapo. Esta resolución refiere principalmente al entender.
So this resolution
No solo como edificios tradicionales de colecciones y de prácticas de conservación y exposición, sino que también se hace énfasis en el valor para el desarrollo social, cultural, medioambiental, económico.
We can talk here about the values that we have for development, for social, cultural, environmental, and economic development, focused on the 1960s. And in 1972, there was a definition of museum roles responding to local and community needs. So this resolution 5, next slide please, puts forward a greater recognition of and support for the vast number of community-led organizations that do not currently meet the ICOM museum definition of 2007. And that's something, of course, that we're working on at the moment. And these institutions promote the objective of safeguarding and promoting access to sustainable use of natural, cultural, and intangible heritage for the environmental, social, and economic development of communities and social justice, of course. Then we need to think about local and regional differences and demonstrate awareness of the geopolitical dimension of museums. We need to recognize the value of community-based museums in promoting ICOM, UNESCO, and international charter instruments and their values with regard to human rights, especially in the context of indigenous and ethnic minority communities, and in the face of the challenges posed by migration. Next slide, please. Then we need to foster collaborative work, as we've already said, working in partnerships with museums, with regional institutions, and look to build the capacity of community-based museums and eco-museums in their transformative approaches in order to encourage sustainable living communities, territorial development, and the protection and enhancement of cultural landscapes. And then, finally, we need to strengthen, facilitate, and mobilize ICOM's national and international communities, as well as regional alliances and affiliated organizations, so they can act as mediators for a better understanding of culture at the community level and across regions, so they can encourage social cohesion. Next slide, please.
Y tal vez aquí un foco más localizado en donde yo estoy, hablando desde el
perhaps we could talk about this in a more general way. Where I am in Chile, in South America, you can see the challenges of South America here. What are our challenges? We have sociological challenges here linked to a historical and social background that do not necessarily face the same issues as other regions in the world. And climate change is human-induced. So there is a lack of balance between nature and humans, and this needs to be improved. And there are different this is creating difficulties in terms of opportunities for work that we have. Next slide, please. The museological practice from the South American and Caribbean region seeks to provide spaces to address the socio-ecological challenges of the territory and to guide the values put forward in the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs, with an emphasis on those that contribute to living well in these territories. We're talking about inclusion, migration, etc. Next slide, please.
¿Cómo asociamos estos desafíos a las prácticas museológicas?
How can we bring together museological practices with these challenges? After years of commitment and demands and requests for this, on the 1st of August 2020, a declaration was made which said that these commitments had often been ignored by traditional and dominant museology, And the social function of the museum needs to be materialized and recognized by political and social structures. Sustainable museology is that which works on the basis of memory, resistance, gender equality, diversity, accessibility, and the need to revise narratives, among others. Sustainability is a condition that facilitates the dignified fulfillment of the institution functions and contributes to the good living, to good lives of the communities in which they're located.
Los museos que refieren a transgresión de derechos humanos, a reivindicación.
These brings together different museums focused on human rights and other areas. This is what sustainable museology needs to focus in on. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Karin. I can see that Estelle has started launching the questions, and you are wondering whether these contributions are inspiring you in terms of the opportunities and the ideas that they present. Would anyone like to feed back now and respond to these first two speakers? Okay, then we're going to continue with the presentation from Aude. Thank you very much, Karin. I think we'll have opportunity to talk about what you shared with us later on. So Aude Porcedda is a professor at the University of Quebec, and in 2011 she published some French documentation with Serge Chemnier, who is also here, and this was about sustainable development in museums in France, and I think she'll take a bit further what Karin has already been sharing with us and focus in particular on the meta-referential nature of sustainable development, which is helping us to develop the museums of the future and as museums of places that are good places to be.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Juliette, Raoul-Duval, for the interview. When I wrote my doctoral thesis on museums and sustainable development, it's a piece of work I did with Serge. I explained to my professors how museums could be interested in sustainable development. I looked at eco-museums in particular, eco-museums which started in 1970, and there was the idea of co-development. So it's very interesting because it talks about a vision of sustainable development and sustainability that is focused on local territories. In order to answer the question, how have museums become interested in sustainable development? If you go back to the period from the 1960s to 1990s, people became more aware of inequalities, injustices, and the risks of a worldview focused on continuous growth and the infinite exploitation of resources. And the fact that science wasn't credible. There was a lot of controversy with the Brundtland report, which focused on economic and environmental stakeholders. Mr. Personnaz talked about this at the start. The idea of sustainable development came through the environmental world. So there were environmental actions were highlighted in organizations. This controversy is explained in exhibitions. It's been talked about in school books, on TV, and so on. Alongside this co-development, alongside the Rio Summit in 1992, the cultural world was already, there was a Pérez de Cuéllar report. It's like a Bible of sustainability. It talks about a new universal ethics, commitment to pluralism, to creativity, and the challenge of a mediatic world, the environment and culture, and how to rethink cultural policy. This is a 76-page work which gives the basis for sustainable development today. The other thing that is important for the world of museums, because I'm talking about recent events, but in 1988, there was a Museums of America Summit at San Jose in Costa Rica, and a pamphlet came out of this which was presented by various people like McGhie, who wrote a lot about sustainable development. Joanne Landry and Anna Jett were from Quebec. There was a work that came out of this that was called Museums and Sustainable Communities. In this summit that was held in 1988, there was a process which was about sustainable co-development, which was focusing on promoting positive developments and the balance between the different places. We can see that people are talking about this going back quite a way. I want to go back as well. When I started working on my doctoral thesis, there was no museum which had really taken a stance on this. But then projects such as the Eden project, the Biosphere, and in Montreal, the Space for Life, and then the Quai Branly Museum in Paris was the first to have written out a sustainable development action plan in the 2000s. There wasn't a ministry for sustainable development at the time. That only came in 2002. I think the Quai Branly Museum came a little bit after that, but that's where sustainability started to come from. Curators were starting to think about that when they're thinking about preventive conservation. Then since the year 2000, we've seen some things like the grandiose architecture, the overflowing collections, then people wanting to rethink conservation and curation policies. There was a concern with becoming more environmental friendly, and then the sense of working with visitors. But I think, in my view, the thing that changed things is the idea of corporate social responsibilities when that came onto the scene. When museums realized that they weren't just about presenting knowledge, but they were a company, an organization, and so on. All of this approach to corporate social responsibility gave the museum world some tools to implement things, and we realized that governance was everyone's issue. There was a thought about the way governance should change in museums, and there were new experts who were management, and we saw the important role of civil society in order to rethink the museum and the experience around this. Another movement that was going on there was the caring museum movement, the concern for others, the inclusion. We saw when we looked at Eco Museum that there was a concern to present museums as something that was caring, that would take care of visitors and adapt themselves to their abilities. After my PhD, I worked in Paris at the Jardin des Plantes in order to I was working for Vincent Craffin, who was head of sustainable development at the time, and I thought that at the museum there, it would be easy to implement things, but it was very difficult. And then I moved to the Museum of Civilization in Quebec. When we looked at the Cultura project, it was all about being people-centered. Then I'd had no issues with bringing in sustainability approaches. It was very interesting to say was that the place in which it was people centered was much more concerned with people and the environment. It was interesting, much easier than in the place where the environment was the same. So there's a little bit of a paradox there. This highlights for us together is what makes implementation of sustainable development so complex. What I saw in my PhD thesis and as a professional working in museums, and now as a professor in universities, I saw that there were a number of elements that are inherent to museums and inherent to organizational change, societal change. There's an evolution in political action with the changes in governance that were part of the movements that followed on from the sustainability movements. Applying a standard, a sustainable development standard, a standard for accessibility or so on is not enough. Consulting experts is not enough either. We have seen that public action must also draw in stakeholders and empower stakeholders. As an organization, we can't just define standards or take on expert opinions. We need to take into account our different stakeholders. So citizen participation or participation of other stakeholders is really important. In the museums, it can sometimes be seen as taking away from the weight of the experts. So that's a real issue, which is making sustainable development implementation more difficult. Because who are the experts? The curators, the mediators, or are the citizens or the suppliers who are stakeholders with museums experts? I've also seen that museums are very complex organizations. A museum is lots of different people, curators, educators, researchers, there are administrators. The administrators and managers tend to have the power. I'm not wanting to be pejorative in saying that. When I talk about power, it's the ability to enable someone to do something or prevent someone from doing something. So bringing change into a museum is very difficult. Not everyone is aware how complex the world of a museum is. For a long time, curators in all museums there are curators, but in the Museum of Civilization there's other managers and different roles. So it depends who's looking at the museum, and that makes things very complex. Another thing that was very complex is that when you're trying to bring sustainability into an organization, the cross-cutting nature of the activity is very difficult because there's got to be interaction between different stakeholders. Any horizontal cross-cutting policy, we can't be against universal accessibility, against gender equality, against sustainable development. So on a policy level, people will say they agree, but in terms of action, when you get into the function, the day-to-day function of a museum, it gets forgotten. We'll say that we're going to do it, but it's just displayed as an objective. That was one of the key points of my PhD thesis, that the values that are put in place in the day-to-day are often different to the policies. A director who I met said, I'm in favor of sustainable development, but he came to work in a big 4x4 with lots of pollution. So a manager polluting with a 4x4 for him was, this car was a bit of a status symbol, a symbol of power. So there's some changes in that as well. I was laughing with Lucie the other day and with Elsa, and I said that when I came to the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, I had a colleague who put post-it notes to ask everyone to switch off the lights, and everyone was laughing at him for that. But these days we have documents and stickers saying turn off the lights or don't use too much electricity. That's been a change since the early 2000s. I want to show you my experience and my reflections to say why it's difficult to implement sustainability. It's important to ensure that implementation is not done by technocrats. We had tools and processes from the Quebec government to bring things into the organization, but on the long term, I ended up finding myself very alone with my long-term strategy and my development, my sustainable development documents, because it was such a technocratic process. So beware of institutionalization and technocratization. Eco-friendly approaches are things that can be institutionalized, but it's not the only thing. When I had to justify it to the government what we were doing, I had to tell them what we're doing for people in different cultures. What are people doing in mediation? What did our technicians do? I went to see all the departments. And I was looking at what they were doing and how that could be more sustainable. I think it's very important to remember that diversity. We shouldn't think that sustainable development is the solution to all problems. That's often what I heard. That's why I sometimes talk about meta-referentials, because sometimes people use a concept to get other messages across. But the important thing is if you implement sustainable development, it's not that you're trying, you need to not try and solve a problem that you haven't identified the symptoms of. If you can't differentiate between a cold and COVID, you might have the same symptoms, but you need a different medical treatment. So you need to think about the symptoms and not the problem when you're thinking about sustainability, in order to limit resistance to change. Two more things, and then I'm going to move on to my final slide. Sometimes there are people who have too broad a view. Everyone works in sustainable development, but so the question you need to ask is, what's really changing? I've not seen that much change. I've heard lots of things being done on the ground, perhaps more than we would say. It sometimes need to just be promoted. So when we talk about museums and sustainability, I don't know whether things need to be revolutionized. How far do we actually need to go? Let me give you two examples. In the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, they were very happy to say that they weren't using pesticides and they were using traditional approaches, traditional practices to protect plants. And so they hadn't started using pesticides. So sometimes a slow approach can be the right attitude to things. Sometimes staying with older past practices can be a good thing. So obviously we need technology to improve well-being and welfare, but sometimes the past is good as well. There's also changes in values. Before I started thinking about this question, when we talked about sustainable development, he was seen as a policeman with a big stick. Why? I've now been thinking about this question for more than 20 years, and I'm saying, what's happening now so that ICOM International is researching this and has been doing so for more than 10 years. I think there is a number of things. It's not just about the pandemic. There's a number of societal changes that are underway. There's been things that have been collapsing. People only change if they are forced to change, if the previous way of working isn't working. I'm going to use a metaphor. I hope you don't take it in a negative way. Pascal Pic used it in a radio lecture on Radio Canada. He's a paleoanthropologist, and he says a monkey only lets go of a branch if it can catch another one. That's what's sustainable development is a bit like. Lots of things are collapsing. The Western universalism, there's the woke culture, there's Black Lives Matter, there's the slow movement. There's a whole number of things that have changed, which have shown that the values that were previously in use were not in line with the values that people wanted to see. All of these social movements have shaken up our established social order, but the most surprising thing in all of these changes is that they became institutionalized very quickly. After the Me Too movement, there were very quick reactions, not just a social movement or an NGO movement. There was an institutionalization of it. So the pandemic has allowed us to focus back on scientific discourse, although it's still a critique that's important. In the 60s and to the 90s, that was challenged. That can give museums a role and a credibility. We're seeing an increase in inequality, in distress, in vulnerability for all. You'll have all seen that. We've seen that the pandemic has operationalized the theory of small steps on a global state. Individual actions can save the collective. Vaccination is an example, and that individualization can harm the collective. So we've operationalized things that we've talked about since the start of sustainability. We've seen that changing habits have enabled us to function even with sometimes more independence and efficiency. There's a sociologist just called Dupuy who said that with the pandemic, the independence and autonomy enabled people to work in a very different way. They didn't have to refer back to management to take decisions because the managers took a lot of time to discuss things when other people were working on the ground. There's a greater independence and autonomy in the workplace, and I think that will need to be negotiated with managers, and I think we might challenge the role of managers with all of these relationships. So when I talk about sustainable development, even the role of managers, the way in which they should see their roles might need to change. One of the things that we've seen is that the ideas of negative growth have been tested. Things that have slowed down. We've thought more locally. We've used new technologies. We saw that these things didn't stop our systems from working. Things were continuing to work, and sometimes these approaches stopped us from collapsing. That enabled us to continue and to survive. So these principles of negative growth were shown to be useful. So sustainable development is like a meta-reference that enables us to avoid standardizing things. If you standardize things, you make them incomprehensible. They won't be consistent or logical. It will enable all of us to invent the museum of tomorrow and find solutions to the problem and respond differently to their needs. But everyone needs to agree on the changes that need to be made. This is my conclusion. Are museums credible actors for sustainable development? I will say only if they commit to accountability and not just credibility. They need to ensure interaction and recognition for all. They must open up and resonate with the complexity of its internal and external environment. We need to move away from our ivory towers. That's true for museums and other areas such as education. We need to move away from a sectoral and bureaucratic vision and be focused on our territory. Museums base their work on the interdisciplinary nature of knowledge. I think there's a lot of help that is available, and museums, if they want to take this path, need to stay free. We need to avoid this risk of standardization. Museums must retain the capacity to critique what is going on, and not become the bearers of an alienating ideology. If sustainable development is vague, it needs to be thought of as a destination. Everyone would be able to use their cultural project to invent and defend this notion. But for some, how will we come back to the world that we knew before? People are starting to buy tickets to go on holiday in exotic destinations again. Is it conceivable to go back to the world that we knew before, or will these 2 or 3 years of pandemic have made an impact through meetings like the ones we have tonight and through other ways? Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Aude. Estelle, are there any questions or responses that you want to feedback to us? Yes, thank you very much, Helen. Thank you very much to Aude Porcedda for this very interesting presentation of the subject. You referred to the eco-museums at the start of your talk. Céline Chanas, who is the chair of the Federation of Eco-Museums and Museums of Society, said something on the chat. I'm just going to summarize her question. In some ways, you partly answered it, but in your experience, in your observations, if you can sum things up, what are the 2 or 3 key obstacles that you come up with if you want to implement a sustainability strategy? How can you get over those? What are the chief obstacles? I think the main obstacle is that everyone stays in their own position. They can't imagine what other people please. Eco-museums. Museums are not a place for keeping artifacts, but for welcoming visitors. So people need to get together and think about what's their museum, I don't want to create any standardization or uniform approach. So the big obstacle is that if there is no negotiation between all of the internal stakeholders, you won't get anywhere. There needs to be negotiation. If we're going to take an eco-friendly approach, let's go for it. Or should we look at all of the aspects of sustainability, circular economy, inclusion? Yes, no. I think you need to make sure that is taken on as a policy. So the first obstacle is that there's no negotiation between different stakeholders within the museum. A second thing is that if the top management think one thing and the employees think something else, that there's sort of middle management. They don't pass things on for a range of different reasons, some very legitimate reasons. I don't want to judge that because what I've seen when we've worked together with Selim Merlu and Eva from Lucie, we realized that there's a whole generation of people who are there, they're wanting to implement sustainability, but there's a whole level of middle managers that's a bit lost in this subject, and so the top management can't do anything because they're not informed. So there's something that needs to be worked through in terms of the structure and governance of museums. What other obstacles? I think the other obstacle is perhaps thinking that sustainability is just an environmental question. It's actually a societal issue. It's about organization. It's a proposal that has been made, a proposition that's made to the museums and to any organization to think about what world we want to show to the future, thinking about what has been left to us from the past and what do we want to create for the future. I think that's a way of thinking about things that could guide our action. Another obstacle, the museum in Montreal that I know was a municipal museum. What they put sustainability in their strategy plan, but the only people who were doing anything with sustainability was the Department of Material Resources and then the educational arm. But they were forced by the municipality to do sustainability work. Alongside that, the Civilization Museum in Quebec was forced by the government to prove that it was working on a sustainable development. So they had to find things to prove that. When I was working in Paris for the Jardin des Plantes, there wasn't this pressure and it was harder to do. So I think there needs to be an alignment between the government, civil society and organizations. That's probably all I would say about that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So perhaps we could just think more about what Aude's just said as we listen to Bettina Leidl, who is the president of ICOM Austria. She's going to present to us how Austrians are engaged in these eco transitions. And then we were just talking about the need for governance to be adapted. And I think Austrian museums have really tried to get hold of this subject. And Bettina is going to now present this to us. Thank you, Bettina.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation and possibility to tell you how Austrian museums, or we as ICOM Austria, try to implement two projects. One for museum. One is a project about the SDGs, so it gives a good reference to the presentation of Henry McGhie at the beginning of the conference, and then I will also at the end of the presentation I tell you something about the eco label for museums, which was also created by ICOM Austria. Yeah, as everybody is overwhelmed with the question, what is the role of museums and during the COVID-19 pandemic? So the whole cultural sector, so maybe we go to the next slide, please. The whole cultural sector, and especially the museums and exhibition spaces, have been affected by the COVID-19 crisis, and of course the month-long lockdowns have raised questions about the role and the contribution of museums to the society. How relevant are museums with their collections and exhibitions today? Is it fair to subsidize museums with additional public funds to lead them out of the crisis? And what can museums contribute to an understanding of community and the solidarity of a society? The challenge of, next slide, the challenge of museums is to ask themselves again and again, what is our core task and how do we communicate topics to whom? Visitors' numbers should no longer be the dominant factor of success, and with the collapse of international tourism in whole Europe, museums can no longer afford their pursuit of more and more exhibitions and more visitors. So we have to change, and we do have to rethink museums. And the Corona crisis also forced us to focus more on our relation between mankind and nature and the effect of climate change. Next slide. Next slide, please. As we all know, we are convinced that museums are generators of value, and museums do an essential work to promote and strengthen the understanding of community and the solidarity of a society. Museums can't ignore the topic of sustainability, as we just heard from Aude, and climate change. And the Agenda 2030 has given museums an important role in the social, economic, and ecological transformation of our society. Next slide. The idea to open museums to the public dates to the Age of Enlightenment. Their task is to teach democracy, to educate people to take up the human and civil rights, and not to leave art or the discussion about it to the elites. So today, when society is becoming more and more fragmented, and the idea of democracy is constantly being questioned. So this is why it is so important to emphasize the role of museums as places for learning. And the COVID-19 crisis has made the fault lines, maybe next slide, the fault lines in our society even more visible. Maybe, can we go to the next? So the COVID-19 crisis had made the fault lines in our society even more visible, and from this ICOM Austria, we ask ourselves the questions: how can we make visible the contribution that museums make to the solidarity of a society, and how can we make the contribution more comprehensible that museums make to the understanding of community. Next slide, please. And from this framework in mind, ICOM Austria developed the project 17 museums, 17 SDGs. As we heard from Henry before, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which were passed by the United Nations in 2015, provide the ideal framework. The 17 goals follow an agenda for the sustainable transformation of our societies. So the SDGs are a universal call to end poverty, protect the planet, and improve the lives and prospects of everyone and everywhere. Next slide, please. So this is Austria, as you see, with the 17 museums located. So it was very important for us to have really complete different museums, from museums of contemporary art to small regional museums, or museums for Museum of Natural History, and so this, and also spread all over Austria. So, and the intention of the project 17 museums, 17 SDGs, was to promote the knowledge about the Agenda 2030 and to examine the extent to which the 70 SDGs can be implemented in the daily museums work. Because, you know, especially art museums, for example, they say, yeah, what do the SDGs have to do with our museums work? So it was a pilot project, and of course we discussed the match to match the invited museums with the obvious SDG. So which museum gets which SDG, and at the end, so like the museums, the working museums receives the SDG 8, but since in the end the idea about the SDGs is that all SDGs should be reflected in the daily museums work, and so we decided to use the lottery. And so the project 77 is about raising awareness and transferring knowledge about communicating context, critical questioning, and reflection. But dealing with the SDGs is also about creating impulses, and it's about a role and encouraging others to follow. Next slide, please. The projects and activities that were set and developed with the 70-7 project range from a repair cafe to a biodiversity day. They overcome language project that overcomes language barriers about garbage collecting campaigns, or a charging station for electronic cars. There were intervention in permanent exhibitions, temporary installations, guided tours, discourse events, and of course workshops. And and what was very also the activities were accompanied by topic-specific blogs or podcasts, for example, on peace. We had booklets on water and water pollution, handouts and greening, urban housing, and many other communication activities like guided tours. Next slide, please. So over a period, of 17 weeks, so last August to December, each week the focus was on one museum and then on one SDG. So also the communication of the project was contributed by the museums and ICOM, and so they had the chance to report on their individual projects. Next slide, please. Yeah, but as we all know, and as Aude just said, unfortunately, the large what came out with this project was also the awareness of museums to implement sustainability, and what do museums do contribute to climate change. Made it more visible and also more active in their daily museums work. And because we all know, unfortunately, the large museums and exhibition spaces with their elaborated infrastructure, and services have a very poor climate balance and a very high CO2 carbon footprint, and museums are themselves part of the problem, and the effects on the institutions are making with regards to climate protections are being increasingly noticed by the visitors. So the visitors, also if the manager doesn't know, the visitors have a very high awareness on the subject, how museums, what would museums do for the climate. And in order to improve the climate balance, it is necessary to divide the ecological transformation into sub-processes and field of actions. In other words, to approach climate neutrality step by step. So obtaining, we implemented the Austrian eco-label, which I will just present. For example, in the museum I work now, in the museums quarter and all the institution, it's a first step as well as a contribution to the topic of sustainability and resource saving cultural operations. And it's all for the museums. It's also all about credibility, and so museums can play an pioneer role in the ecological transformation of our society. Next slide, please. So we have different fields, of course, as we already discussed and we discussed. On one hand, we have our environment-related concept and exhibitions. We have the resource-saving exhibition operations, so what's all about production. And of course, we have the energy-reduced infrastructure, and we know that with the technical infrastructure on climate, heat, cold, humidity, for the preservation of the artworks, for the exhibition rooms, archive, and depots. And we have the light issue, so the change to LED. And of course, it's all about the conservation guideline for temperature and humidity, which we have to work with our restoration departments to find a solution. Next slide, please. So we in Austria, we have the an state certification for companies, for institutions. It's the Austrian eco-label, and we ICOM Austria a few years ago, 5 years ago, we started an initiative to write guidelines for museums and exhibition spaces, and the goals and the principles is it's all about the information for the customer, conversing of the offer awareness, rising of awareness, and which is really very important. So for me at the beginning, I didn't have to focus on that it's a state certification. Yeah, so it's not a certification what we museums thought about. So it's monitored. The process is monitored by experts from the field of ecology, and of course the museums experts we already have in the museums. And on the next slide, maybe we can go to the next slide. It's the last one. I just said the criteria. So we divide between general criteria and museum-specific criteria. And as Aude said before, it's so important that it comes from the manager, from the director of the museum, and it goes in all museums department. It's a process. So I was the first museum we did, so it really takes you 6 months, yeah, or maybe in bigger museums, maybe longer, yeah. But it's really a team building process. And so you go in all departments, you have management department, you have communication, you go about this, you go in the offices, what you use the paper, really simple things that you say, okay, we use the paper with the eco label. It's about mobility, the building, of course, what I said before. It's about cleaning, with which chemistry you use, the energy thing, so which energy you buy and you use, and of course it's water, the waste issue, and of course also the exterior. How do you do with your gardens and parks around the museums? And then we created special museum criteria, very important, restoration, conservation, but this at the end, it was less difficult because there's a big awareness of the restoration and conservation departments on the sustainable and environmental issue. Then, of course, all this transportation, the packing, the storage, of course, then you need the companies that go with you on this. Then you have the mediation work, you have the storage, and at the end also your museum's restaurant and your museum store are part in this big picture of sustainability in a daily museum's work. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bettina. Thank you very much. Et on voit bien l'importance de l'équilibre entre les initiatives concrètes.
We see there the importance of the concrete initiatives that we want to put in place and the issues around governance, as Bettina described us. Estelle, I think we should move on through our program. I can see that in the discussions in the chat box, there's a lot of reaction around what our contributors are saying. There's questions around a top-down and bottom-up approach, and I think we'll come back to these later on. Estelle. Yes, I agree. We should gather our questions together and look at them together, perhaps a bit later. Great. So, in the next part of this evening, we wanted to present through the interventions that are coming up of Lucie, Marinier and Elsa Boromée, some pieces of work and the outlooks that have been developed by the Sustainable Development Group that we've put in place within ICOM France in 2021. You can see some reports on our work that the group that Estelle and I have been leading online. But I'm going to hand straight over to Lucie and Elsa now, straight away. Lucie, we can't hear you right now. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Yes. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Hélène. Thank you, Juliette, for this invitation. I'm a professor at the National Conservatoire of Arts and Crafts. I'm responsible for communication, but I'm also a museum professional. I've worked for the Museum of Modern Art for a number of years. So I do share a number of the observations that have already been mentioned by Aude. But I think the interesting thing is that we've been able to focus on some of these areas within our group, sustainable development within ICOM France, and that we've been seeing in the observations and research that we've been doing within the museum. Within our sustainable development group, we've talked about a number of issues. I think Hélène, we've developed some resources which Hélène is going to talk about in the chat box. The first thing that we've looked about is to think about the role of the museum and the way it works alongside sustainability. This question also touches on ecological transitions, but also on the role of museums, its governance, its methodology, and its the professions within the museum. One of the things that came back in our discussions was to say that the role of the museum is to make things intelligible, to present things, represent things, and to think the unthinkable about art or science. It's all about presenting things or representing things, representing things. We sometimes need to think about things like the finite nature of our planet, as Bruno Latour talks about in the little book of metaphysics of Kusnt. So in themselves, museums, as many colleagues have said, might enable us to get to the tipping point, as Malcolm Gladwell described it, this point at which 10% of a population based on a committed minority starts to adopt new behaviors that can change social norms and bring the silent majority with them. That's a little bit what Aude was talking about with the post-it notes, where the guy was annoying people with his post-it notes, and then it moves on to something that everyone accepts. Museums, I think, are aware of their great responsibilities, whether it's art, science, or social museums, to help people become aware of the environmental and societal situation we are faced with today. I think the second thing that's been discussed around museums and their ethical approaches, we've got a number of values, so conserving, preserving things, analysis, scientific objectivity, and some of these values tie in with sustainability values. That's great, and that's our key values that we want to talk about, but something that we need to think about is that some of our values could be work alongside sustainability if we rethink them in quite a deep way, particularly some of the work around communication and education. We need to think differently about the relationship between individuals and museums. So Juliette was talking about emotion, and those are questions we can think about around sustainability. How can we measure the impact with our audience and with the general public? We need to think about some of the values that work against sustainable development. That's where we're at today. Some of these issues around the limitless development or growth of our collections, the technical approaches that we need to climate and air conditioning. There's the idea of building more and more museums as well is something that raises questions. So how can we reconcile the production of museums with the values that museums are trying to carry on? So we need to rethink and think about the relationship between content and the way in which we confuse or disseminate them based on different establishments and their missions. The second major area of reflection is that professionals are asking for a common guide shared between museums, or a guide within each museum. It's not an easy thing within the French setting, where there's quite a separation between artistic and scientific questions and the public and the visitors on the other hand. So there needs to be a new way of working to bring together the different expertises within museums. There are managers, curators, administrators, there's people who are responsible for visitors, and sustainable development managers who are within our groups. So there's a broad view of all of the professions within museums. So when we work in a sector such as museums, where there are professions that have been well connected and well understood. We've seen with some of our sound technicians, they moved from the conservators thinking about a move from where they're thinking just about preserving the work to a much broader approach to sustainability. So obviously, we've talked quite a bit about management. How do we get everyone on board? Sustainability is not a question just for specialists. We need to have a multi-factor approach. We need to think about our scientific and artistic projects. We're not just thinking about carbon footprints and the carbon content, but we need to look at this question in lots of ways based on what each museum's project is. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach to sustainable development. So a number of needs have been expressed. Methodologies, about governance, about subjects to look at, resources. We need an open source approach so that different resources can be shared. And then we need to identify museums as commissioning bodies with a common strategy in order to put pressure on service providers in buildings, our transport providers, and different ministries and political bodies that oversee us. The group is also thinking about the idea of standards. Should there be mandatory legal standards? They can be useful and they need to evolve. There's a lot of advocacy that's required. We've got fire standards, which require that we stop using certain materials. But as Aude says, standards can be an obstacle. Too much standardization around carbon footprints for each museum would be something that could paralyze action, and it would work against the idea of empowerment of each museum to take hold of the issue. However, what we have said is that the legitimate stakeholders can give us new references. So in the area of climate change and areas around transport, we do need to work with our professional networks and think about what new standards, new norms should be. There should be questions around copyright, questions of donations, rules around conservation. it's important to listen to professions who draw on other guides or colleagues from museums that are in countries with more limited financial resources. That's not easy because that goes against our instinct to categorize things. There's also a question of around where power is seated. We've talked a lot about sociological issues. We need to think about how power in our museums is power around, how objects are traveled, about how they're conserved, and with the air conditioning. We need to think about how some of these standards should be challenged that have were potentially seen as successes in the past. We need to think about different types of projects, new types of projects which might be legitimate. We need to diversify this, not just the spaces or the objects. We can also think about the time, length of time, timetables, but also the nature of our projects. So in conclusion, in our working group, there is a strong intention and very widely shared between all professionals in different types. There is a real awareness of sustainability issues and the ability to see sustainability as a way of working against other challenges, against standardization. There's how can we use museums to tell a different story? We need to identify the major subjects where we need to make progress: climate, transport, size, nature, and content of different projects. And we're trying to do that using the different tools that we're sharing with you little by little as we find them. And perhaps you might be able to help us to source different guides, and we can identify different obstacles. Thank you very much, Elsa. Good evening. My name is Elsa Boromée. I'm a sustainability advisor at the National Museum of Natural History in Paris. I'm going to give you a viewpoint from my field work, and I want to feedback some of the discussions we've had within the working group as well. My particular viewpoint on what is going on within public cultural establishments is as follows. Lucie said it very rightly. There's a strong need to find useful information. Aude was saying, and there was something that's needed in terms of connection between the state, the different institutions, and the civil society. Having worked in different museums, we've got a framework for sustainable development which is getting tougher, which is a requirement for different, and there's increasing awareness which is carried by civil societies. We cannot be deaf to these different factors anymore, and currently in France, certainly over the last few years, we can see that there's been a whole range of different sustainable development strategies that have been implemented. The national strategies give guidelines, they set a heading for us as a country. So there are national strategies which have come out of the 2002 Johannesburg Summit on Sustainable Development. These came out through Europe over the noughties. In France, we had a first national action plan in 2008, then another one in 2010. Then we've had a national strategy of ecological transition, which was brought in by the previous government for the 2015-2020 period. Alongside these big national strategies, we've seen a number of approaches which are referred to as the exemplary state. It's focus on getting sustainability into the heart of the way different institutions work. This initiative goes back to 2008, and it carries on because we've got this new initiative called Eco-Responsible Public Services, which is requiring all public services to be environmentally friendly, and these obligations apply to all public services. Alongside this eco-responsible public services initiative, there's a stronger and stronger framework, and public institutions, particularly cultural institutions, are being held accountable for their sustainability by reporting methods. There's a new bill, the Elan bill, or climate and resilience bill. There are regulations which focus on trying to manage the and control energy consumptions. They're trying to reduce energy use by 40% by 2030. 50% by 2040, 60% by 2050. There's a web platform which asks institution to be accountable for its energy uses, and if they can't achieve the targets, to explain why for different reasons. So in the past, the frameworks were a little bit more flexible, but these frameworks are now becoming stricter and tougher, and they apply to all public institutions, and in particular, they apply to us. This is leading to a major change in the way that the institutions are working beyond the cultural projects in order to meet these ever strict regulatory obligations. The cultural institutions and all public institutions are organizing themselves by recruiting sustainability consultants or sustainability managers. Those that can't afford this put in place internal working groups in order to focus on the sustainability requirements and to disseminate them through the institution. So as Lucie said, we need to work on different areas: purchasing, greenhouse gas control, energy consumption, and societal, social aspects. Fighting discrimination, gender equality, all of these kind of issues. We're also seeing that beyond this very strict and dense regulatory framework, there's a need to find and share information. There are different guides, or there are different people who are responsible for these issues in different organizations, and they need to come together and share what they're doing, pool their knowledge, as a colleague has previously said. So they come together in different working groups. Just as an illustration, there's this sustainability club for public institutions, which is part of the ecology and energy transition ministry. There's another working group that's led by the Ministry of Culture. There are other groups that bring together entire value chains, freelance workers, artists, collectors, people who work in the social economy and in public cultural institutions. The idea of these working groups is to identify the obstacles to the ecological transition. So what we're looking for is to see the value chain transformed in order to ensure that exhibitions and their production are taken into account, and negative externalities are taken into account. Not all bodies are as mature, but a number of bodies have been doing that for at least 10 years. So things have been done. On my level, I note that these different institutions need to test things and have the right to make mistakes in order to be able to share those mistakes within these collective settings. So then the different stakeholders can get a hold of those obstacles. Let me give you one example of this. Within the Sustainable Development Club for Public Institutions, there's a working group that was led by Université and the Quai Branly Museum between 2012 and 2016. This working group also had the Museum of Humanity in Paris, the Louvre Museum, and the National Library of France, the BNF, and other key stakeholders. This was strongly supported by the Ministry of Culture. This group identified that the general code for public property did not allow that scenographical items from exhibitions couldn't be donated. They suggested a change to the law, and they got this adopted. So this was quite a proactive approach to change the framework, which had been an obstacle to this change. So this derogation now exists to all public institutions, even those overseen by local authorities. Other working groups have worked on eco-design and have shared the work that they've done with peer groups. In particular, you might have heard of the Guide to Eco-Design by the National Library of France. There's a guide developed by the X Festival or by the Fine Arts Palace in Lille around some of the exhibitions they've done. There's been a lot of exchange about experiments or work on standardization of scenography, reflections about sobriety in transport. Lucie was talking about procurement and the way in which the social economy can be used in procurement. At our museum, to give you a very concrete example, when we look at our exhibition, which is called Frontières de l'Humain, we carried out an experiment where we looked at all of these questions, and in particular, we focused on procuring second-hand items and second-hand materials. What we wanted to do was use second-hand materials in the exhibition that we were producing. Unfortunately, we saw that there were a number of economic and legal obstacles that made that very difficult for us to do. So we weren't able to actually do what we wanted to do with this operation. But we did manage to clear up a number of the potential obstacles, and we found some solutions in order to keep hold of and retain some of these secondhand materials and not create waste out of it. So we've identified a number of solutions that could, in the long term, enable these secondhand materials to be used in very sober exhibition. I'm a very talkative person. I do apologize for that, but I'm going to wrap up soon. One minute left, please. I just wanted to go back to the question of guides and standards. We didn't define the terms that a standard is a requirement, whereas a guide is a collection of recommendations. So this need for a guide is often discussed and mentioned by stakeholders in the field. There are a number of things that have worked, particularly in higher education and research institutions. They came together with the support of the Ministry of Education, Research and Innovation, with a number of collectives, with students, and with people in higher education. They built a sector-specific guide. This sector-specific guide has existed since 2010, and it's peer-reviewed in order to take into account regulations. It's not seen as a constraint. It sets a framework out. It gives some direction, a way to go for the next few years. It highlights some of the issues, and it's a tool that can be used to discuss things. It enables higher education institutions to start making the change. But in order to have this document come to light, there needed to be significant political support from the Ministry for Education, Research and Innovation. The ministry put resources in it and into it and brought different stakeholders together in order to develop this guide. It's been a real success, and in our museum we've been using this guide since 2013. To conclude, I would note that yes, different institutions, different museums are more mature. Some are more mature than others. Some who have been working on these issues for a number of years and feel like they need to go to a next step. There's a lot of initiatives that institutions are using to measure their environmental impact. Measuring is useful in order to put in place actions to reduce the impacts. So there needs to be training and support to help different institutions understand these concepts. Thank you very much. Thank you, Elsa.
Thank you very much, Elsa. Sorry to have to cut you. cut you off, but we need to keep moving on. So we're going to move on straight with Olivier Lerude, and what he's going to share with us makes a great deal of sense, given what we've just heard. He is responsible for representing these questions within the French Ministry of Culture. How can these questions be taken into account in public policy? Olivia, over to you. Thank you very much, Hélène, and thank you to ICOM and INP for their invitation. I am perhaps the least qualified person this evening because I am not a curator, I am not a museum professional. I am involved with the Museums of France department, and I work with a number of professionals who know this area much better than me, but I think what was really interesting, what would be interesting to talk to you about now would be with regard to public policy around sustainable development. This is something that the ministry is trying to develop, and we want to see how museums can find their place in these public policies. So Helen has said this, I am a high civil servant for sustainable development. It's a bit of an elevated term, but the focus of my work is to define sustainable development policies in our ministry, the ministry I work for. Elsa talked about this earlier. We have a certain exemplarity. We want to ensure that we are properly dealing with sustainable development in our ministry, and for ministries that want to go further, such as the Ministry of Culture, we want to define policies that would help us to go further. So, for example, for festivals, we've just developed a sustainable festivals charter with which festivals can sign up to, and then there's a number of systems that would help with transition for cinemas or the written media, and to help them move forward in terms of sustainable policies. Of course, our focus is on our essential work. Lucie said this early in the working group. There was this question of what the real focus of a museum's work is. But museums, of course, need to keep presenting works to the general public and to conserve heritage and culture. In a number of sectors, in museums, as in other sectors, everything needs to be invented and worked out from here. I put everything together here. We're trying to start inventing the world of the future, if we want to talk about it a bit in a grandiose way, but the world isn't really ready. Our ways of working are not really suitable for what we're trying to do. So we're trying to invent things. And we want to also experience these things. If we talk specifically about museums, the development of public policies has taken a number of forms over a number of years. We have a number of different approaches which rely a great deal on the expertise of our operators. This is a methodological approach that has been taken by the Department of the Museums of France. We want to trust people who are responsible for carrying museums forward in France. We want to help them, and then when they have a good idea, when there's a good practice, we want to share it with others. So perhaps I could just talk about a few examples of what we've been doing over the last few years. And perhaps the first issue is the issue of buildings. We haven't perhaps talked a great deal about this so far, but this is a key issue for museums because museums are always in buildings. There's a question of energy consumption, of controlling the environment. So of course this means air conditioning. We've talked about new buildings such as the Louvre Réserve, which is the new building, which is a high environmental quality building. We need to ensure that buildings can continue to perform their function. This is obviously crucial in the case of the Louvre Reserve building. So when we develop specifications for a new building in this sector, we are taking into account and including all of these issues in the specifications when we develop new buildings. Of course, this leads us into thinking about energy consumption in museums. And of course, the area of air conditioning is something that's very important in terms of the conservation of works. And this leads all professionals to focus on these questions. Of course, there are budgetary issues that can be involved here. And then we have to stay within our needs, our means. There are cultural standards that need to be taken into account. And then in terms of this issue, that we also need to think about older buildings. Often museums are in heritage buildings, which is one of their key strengths, but we need to think about old buildings. And think about the fact that old buildings often have thermal qualities that are not actually as bad as all that because they were well built. And actually, if we take into account their specificities, we can really move forward on those kind of areas. And so there's a great deal of thought and work that can be done around buildings and move things forward. Another area that we've worked on is the scenography of exhibitions. This is not a single area, but a whole number of areas. Eco-design for temporary exhibitions or permanent exhibitions in museums. It involves the question of circular economy, transport of works, transport, of course, of the visitors, because, of course, when we do an exhibition, we want as many people as possible to come, and obviously that generates a higher carbon footprint. I've seen some things on this in the chat. In terms of eco-design, this is, I'm going to go as quickly as I can, really, because Elsa has talked about the first studies that we did just now. But it's a really interesting example because we identified that the issues of eco-conception linked into reuse. The public authorities didn't know what to do with their property, and they couldn't give away this property because it was a public good. So we worked on that, and once we'd moved forward there was this question of how can we actually do this. Again, we had to think about how to adapt and change the regulations, not of museums, but actually of the French state, about who could receive these works. So we worked with the Ministry of Finance around this question about who could receive public goods, not just even museum collection goods, but now the law has been changed, the regulations have been changed so that public institutions can now give away public property. You can see this, for example, with the Louvre, which is removing some of its collections from its reserves. And it's these questions of resources around all of this, which have been employed to move things forward. Having worked on that area, then we thought about eco-design, because we thought if we need to reuse, in order to reuse things properly, then things needed to be properly designed. If you use nails, then you're going to have to pull it all out and you won't be able to reuse it afterwards. Whereas if it's screwed, if screws are used, you can unscrew them and reuse objects. This is an area that a lot of professionals have been working on in a great way for a long time already. And actually, the obligations that are in place now are very widespread in terms of obligations of sorting waste, of circular use, of reuse. And a number of institutions have already been implementing these kind of policies for a long time with a whole range of projects. And actually, this is a real strength, because whenever we develop new exhibitions, we could have exhibitions that for the general public are sort of seem to be the same, but actually have very different carbon footprints because of the way they've been programmed and designed. So eco-design is an area where there's perhaps almost too many guides around this, but what's important is that teams get hold of this notion. As I was saying, everything needs to be invented, but this is something that people can really move forward on. There is a lot of room for maneuver here. Then there's the question, of course, of transport of works, which is actually very complex from a technical perspective because of insurance issues and the general context, which is not just to do with the work, but it's also complex because this ties into the very notion of what museums are, the presentation of original works to the audiences. Because if we're saying that we don't want to present works to people anymore, then it raises questions about the nature of museums. And for the ministry, the presentation of works is something that's very important in terms of culture, but that doesn't mean we can't work on solutions to really control impacts, and we can think about different solutions, identifying, for example, exhibitions that can maybe compensate others. So perhaps over a year, so perhaps they have an exhibition with works coming from farther afield, and then they'll have an exhibition with more locally sourced works. And just think, it's a very interesting preparation work, which is about just controlling and managing this public policy. And then, of course, there's the digital aspect. Of course, digital technology has saved culture over the last 2 years as we've been locked down with a whole number of different projects. But at the same time, when you talk about digital technologies, then that involves data centers and their footprints, or child slavery in illegal mines who are mining the metals to feed into our computers. I imagine that everyone here has got a mobile telephone with them. These are all aspects that we need to think about. It is possible to have streaming and production that is more environmentally friendly, more ecologically friendly. This is something that the state is starting to think about. There is a digital sobriety strategy that's being developed in France, and this will impact all cultural sectors, and particularly sectors that are doing a lot of streaming. This is a recent area that we're really working on, and it is starting to be managed now. And perhaps the last area I could talk about is the area of training. I just want to mention it because it's also the INP French Heritage Institute that's organizing tonight. This is a key aspect because the training of future creators in this area is really important, and it's something that's happening as they have training modules related to sustainable development. We're seeing culture, architecture, and design schools all taking in this question, which is really important. And just to conclude, the context of the health crisis, recovery plans for Europe and France, the ecological transition, all means that there is an opportunity that's available now. And the Ministry of Culture has really got hold of this. And I just want to mention one of these is the fourth Investments of the Future plan, in which the ministry has decided to dedicate some of the funds under that plan for sustainable development alongside other more standard cultural areas in order to have a call for projects that's just come to an end, which is trying to develop new processes, and museums have applied for funds together with associations around this area. Then there's also going to be a second area working on carbon calculators, and this is something that the sector is really asking for. They're looking for a standard approved calculator which can be used or not, depending on what institution want to do. But this would make possible a consensus across the community, and so that there could, because today we just have too many calculators, too many reference guides, and we need something that we have agreed on in common. And then the third aspect linked into this funding program, there'll be a third call for projects, will be perhaps 2024. This will be the promotion of the role of culture as a vector of ecological transition, a kind of recognition that culture has something to bring around this area, because we think we have an essential role to play in this area, because culture and all that we are doing together needs to really have an impact. So without going into the details of museums, the sustainable development really is a key issue for the ministry, and we want to move forward this cross-cutting public policy. Thank you, Olivier, for all of this very comprehensive information. Thank you. That's really very helpful in terms of very specific aspects of this approach. Estelle, have we got time just to hear one or two reflections or questions? It's true that debate in the chat has focused a lot on digital technology, and thank you to Olivier for having touched on this subject. And then there's also this question that you've just talked about in terms of training and awareness raising. I don't know if other people want to respond to these questions, which are key for what we're wanting to develop in the future. Would it be worth saying something around these areas? Yes, if I could just say something about training. There are a whole range of training programs that are being developed now, short-term programs, long-term programs, with trade associations for short-term ones, or the CNAM cultural center in France is developing longer-term programs. There are art schools, there are other schools, and then a whole number of programs that are developing with other institutions, and it's really interesting to be able to encounter engineers of sustainable development from other sectors. Although museums are not theoretically eligible for this training offer, but do have a look, because there are a lot of opportunities over and above the excellent training offered by the INP. There's a whole range of training programs available. In terms of museums as public institutions, there's a number of areas that could be taken into account. I could perhaps just say that the Resilience Act for climate has suggested that all training bodies should have training programs on sustainable development. So this is something that is being developed. It's something that is going to develop. In terms of the state sector training, the first issue is to identify initial and continuing training that is already in place. So if you have training, for example, on managing the environment in museums, this is already a sustainable development question. Or when focusing on materials, for example, these are sustainable development questions. And at the ministry, we are looking to develop this issue even further, and it's something that's going to continue to develop. In terms of the culture world, this question of training does raise the question of funding, because big museums are maybe big museums, but 95% of cultural institutions in France are small establishments where they won't have any specialist sustainable development engineers. So I think this is something that we need to take into account. We're never going to have lots of professionals who can help us specifically in these areas. So we need to help everyone to increase their skills. For example, in terms of procurement, when your buyer knows how to buy in a sustainable way, then you don't need someone else from the outside to come in. So in terms of training, we're wanting to develop our understanding of sustainable development. And as we've seen, as Lucie mentioned, there needs to be the training of use of tools, and also measuring tools in order to develop our understanding of sustainable development and increase the tools available, which makes this really a very rich experience. Thank you very much. Now we're going to welcome Nathalie Bondil, who's going to join us in this final part of our evening together. We wanted this evening to be a presentation, as we've just heard from the last three speakers, a presentation of the concrete actions that are being put in place by museums, but also consideration of the more general responsibility that we have in terms of sustainable museums, which links into our social role. And I think that Nathalie Bondil's perspective here is important, because she says talking about art is talking about the world. Nathalie, over to you.
Good evening. Thank you, Hélène. Thank you, Juliette. Thank you for Charles Personnaz. Great to hear from you. It's been very instructive. I've just put a few images together in a slide. It's not going to be a long PowerPoint that will send you to sleep. we're going to go straight on to my second slide. I just want to come back to what a number of people have said. Aude, for example, said that this question of sustainability in museums is a meta-referential aspect. It's a multi-factor aspect. One could say that a museum is an organization or enterprise like any other, because these questions around values are being raised in all sorts of other businesses and institutions. Questions around governance, inclusion, there are green committees springing up in these organizations, questions around the way that these organizations relate to the public, reflections around IT, eco-design. Museums are therefore part of a broader reflection, which is something that reflects the new age that we live in. I want to talk in particular about fine art museums this evening, because as Aude said in the historical perspective she gave, there've been eco-museums since the 1970s. There are museums of natural sciences, but for fine art museums, this question of the environment and sustainability is perhaps something that is a bit trickier to get hold of. The only aspect perhaps is more relevant is the fact that these museums want to preserve their works for eternity, but sustainability is a bit of a trickier thing. I like this image that you see on the screen right now. It's something developed by Lord Cultural Resources in Canada, which shows the museum as a kind of a temple in the center, but it is broken out, exploded out into different roles or different missions that we ask of museums in the 21st century. We can see that the museums are places of reciprocity, places where we take into account the needs and the lives of Indigenous people. It's a place where we talk about values and we talk about inclusion. Museums are seeking to be relevant in terms of the values that they are promoting. So it's this very horizontal vision, much less vertical vision that we're wanting to develop, because fine art museums in the past were often very hierarchical, organized by discipline in a very top-down way. And the relationship to knowledge was very top-down. We're now reaching an age where we're not taking such a vertical approach, but more of a horizontal network-based approach. And so all of the issues that we are looking at are relevant to museums, and museums therefore are trying to be places that are very open to the world, places that need to be porous and permeable to their local environment. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, this question of the local environment and the vision of the experts of the collection led to curators and conservators being seen as the people who are experts. We often thought the museums were places where lots of highly qualified experts came together, where different people expressed their opinion on the interpretation of a work of art. But having a 360-degree approach to work of art means moving out of the expert field, and this is essential because it ties in with the horizontal approach that there is there in our society, which is much more interdisciplinary, intercultural, transcultural. Here's an example of an educational platform that we started in the Fine Arts Museum of Montreal. You can see how one piece of art, a real masterpiece in our collection, is expressed and understood by an expert. It's not an art historian in this case, but it's a specialist in environmental studies at McGhie, and then this work is analysed by teachers, and then analysed by students, and then this is taken into schools and used as a way of talking about the environment and nature. We've talked a lot tonight about eco-design. Here's an example from the Institute of the Arab world. It is a question that touches on our values. Sustainability, which we've been talking about, is relevant to all businesses, and each one of us needs to think about how we can put in place these values of solidarity, of empathy, and as in the case of this exhibition, which was about Lebanon, we had a space for donors. We worked with Lebanese people who were the technicians working on this exhibition. They worked on the exhibition space using their own craft knowledge with Lebanese materials such as Lebanese clay. As you all know, Lebanon is going through a major unprecedented crisis, and so this issue of solidarity was very important. We are thinking about questions of values when we think about donations received by the museums and about the programs. We're having to think about it not from a moralizing point of view, but in terms of our values and vulnerabilities. Next slide. More broadly, we need to have humility as a principle, as Claude Lévi-Strauss would have said. So I initiated an exhibition with Laurence Descartes in the Musée d'Orsay, and it was an exhibition that was called The Origins of the Monde, the invention of nature. The idea of this project was to work in a fine arts museum. It wasn't a natural history museum. We were in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, and this project aimed to get the public to think about this very self-centered, this very anthropocentric vision of our humanity that we have in the West, where we see that people are a mirror of God, an image of God, as the biblical text says. And then Darwin presented this idea of people at the top of an evolutionary tree, and all of this has said that we think that nature is at our service, but instead we wanted to take an approach where people are part of nature, a common home, and we wanted to explain this story based on Humboldt, who's one of the first people who understood ecosystems, and we traced the story through to Darwin and through to the present day, and we were thinking about how we could play an integrated role within nature. And we looked at the fact that the environmental cause is not something outside of us, but it's within us. So we understood that humans are denatured animals. Other scientists talk about anaturization. Humanity is one of the species that has taken itself out of nature, and this question focuses on the possibility of renaturing ourselves. This vision enables people not just to have a self-centered, a human-centered view, but it enables people to see themselves within a circle of life, an ecosystem. And one of these parts of this cycle of life, of death, there's a circular vision which we need to embrace within our museums, or and in all aspects of our life. Next slide, please. These philosophical and scientific questions are much more recent for us in our Western mindset, but we should not forget that for many indigenous peoples, these are questions which come very naturally. So for many peoples who have totemic philosophies, or shamanic or animistic philosophies, this difference between nature and humanity, again, between the animal world and humanity, is not as pronounced. It's not as hierarchical, where one is supposed to serve the other, where the animal or the natural world is supposed to serve humanity. There's a much greater sense of circular belonging, which is something that can teach us a lot. When we talk about biodiversity, I think that we should also talk about cultural biodiversity and of the cultures of indigenous peoples. There are 370 million indigenous people, but they represent 20% of land area. So their philosophies need to be examined and explored, and this was the case with the exhibition of Chauvinay Ashuna, who's a very remarkable artist from northern Canada, who gives a voice to these indigenous peoples. They have a very acute awareness of environmental issues. Obviously, these peoples live near the North Pole, and they're very aware of climate change, which is changing their lives in very worrying, with very worrying speed. Next slide. To conclude, I would say the key question is to recenter visitors and audiences in this question of who we are. We often see there are two cultures. The novelist and scientist Charles Percy Snow gave a very interesting lecture in 1959 called The Two Cultures, where he talked about the opposition between the sciences and the humanities. I think it's important to accept that we are 100% biological and 100% cultural, as Edgar Morin says. We need to do this in order to ensure that our museums can take hold of these environmental questions, which draw a lot on scientific knowledge. But this is the reflection that leads us to think about the way our own brains work. Whether you're thinking about Antonio Damasio or Jean-Pierre Changeau, Jean-Pierre Martigues talked about this more recently, we understand that our brain, which is a very plastic organ, is shaped by our cognition, but also by our emotions and by our memory. So there's a whole area, a whole lot of work by which our brains are sculpted by our experiences, the experiences that we come across. So the brain is there to serve our emotions. There's an idea of welfare, well-being, kindness and caring. All of this is understood through the study of mirror neurons. It shows us how aesthetic emotion can impact our well-being. And I think when we think in this way, we have a vision that can help us to see that visitors are at the heart of the values that we want to put in the center of our approach to sustainability. We are physiological, experiential beings that will be able to contemplate and benefit from works of art, derive healing from them. We sometimes talk about art therapy, and we're a long way from the idea of entertainment as a function of museums, but we would move much more towards sustainability in what the museum's experience brings to people in terms of the emotions and the aesthetic well-being that they generate. Thank you very much. Just to conclude, a little word of advice for you. There's a guide that's been developed, which has been developed by ICOM and the OECD, which can think about maximizing the impact on local development when a museum works in its local area. Thank you very much, Nathalie. We could think about visitors as experiential beings or people who can experience things and reflect on things. Hélène Guérin, your work at the MAMAC in Nice, what's your response to what Nathalie said? Your testimony will be very interesting because you have become aware of this subject. You've been aware of this subject for a number of years, and we would really like you to talk about the different experiences, the very pragmatic experiments that you've carried out with the different projects that you have orchestrated. Hélène, over to you. Thank you very much, Nathalie.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really glad to be with you here. I'm really inspired by everything I've heard this evening. You've been talking about this experiential aspect for visitors. That's something I'm really very interested in and something that we work on throughout the year with our team. And I really resonate with what Nathalie Bondil has talked about, this potential of helping everyone take hold of museums and of the collections, which are in a symbolic and real term a public good. And I think sharing this public good is really very important. To come back to this question of sustainable development and ecology, I'm going to say things that have already been said this evening, but perhaps I could start by talking about this small steps approach that Aude Porcedda talked about, I think, and which has brought me to think about how I could involve sustainability in exhibition projects, and also how we could use exhibitions to present ecological issues to the general public. So in the early 2010s, I started thinking about these issues with projects that focused on what artists were doing around these ecological aspects and the nature in danger from the end of the 1950s up to today. And every time I did an exhibition, I tried to bring that together with a way of working that would make it possible to have as many works in situ and relevant scenographies. And to just follow up with a number of things that have already been said this evening, museums are places where we need to share about social issues, not as people who are giving lessons from above or stigmatizing others, but because we're sharing the world of artists and the emotions that works create in us. We can have tools, amazing tools, for raising awareness and helping people to understand through emotion and experiencing things. And this could help move people from a silent majority into a proactive majority. So there's a real lever and lobbying role that we can play. So in terms of this small steps approach, this started for me about 12 years ago when I thought about how to bring together two things which seemed irreconcilable. Big exhibitions with everything that involves international transport, big exhibition pieces, often for a one-off approach, and how to reconcile that with more sustainable approaches. So I decided to work with what was existing, to work with scenographies that already existed, and to invent my exhibition through this constraint by transforming these scenographies as little as possible. So in 2011, I opened my first exhibition based on this principle, and it's become a real working method for me. At the time, I was lucky enough to work with a team that was very aware of these issues and integrated these questions of sustainability and environmental responsibility in the way we approach raw materials with public contracts, etc. And then for me, there was a second step which involved eco-design, not just reuse. And in 2014, I was working with a production team and architects to try and develop a sustainable scenography based on a vocabulary, walls and stands that could be reused many times and that could be reconfigured and adapted over time. So it was about thinking about scenographies that could be reused even over a number of years. So we launched a call for tenders with this focus on scenographies that could be reused. So when I was talking earlier about this combination of ways of doing things and the subjects we were working with, and with my team, we were developing an exhibition where I really started to focus on ecological issues through art and history of art. It was a project called Sublime, and it was launched in 2016, and it was a retrospective perspective on our time, going through the history of art and comparing different moments of disruption in connection with natural catastrophes up to the Anthropocene period, which was a word which was starting to come into public use. So there was a desire to have an artistic impact and to leave a kind of heritage for a number of different exhibitions through this sustainable scenography. And then following that experience in Metz, I was invited to take on a new role where we had an alpine and marine environment, and I wanted to continue the sustainability approach and thinking about now the sustainability of our production methods. And this involved the kinds of things that have already been mentioned tonight in terms of scenography. We developed lists of materials with modules that could be reused, bases or stands that could be reused, and kind of a guide that was made available to the whole team. So basically this is used for a whole range of exhibitions since 2016. I've had lots of materials used in many different kinds of exhibitions. We've also developed exhibition projects with exhibition periods of 5 and 5.5 months. We've developed exhibitions that required less energy using LED lighting in particular. And then, of course, the question of transport is a real issue. I work hard to reduce works coming from elsewhere. So first of all, we work at a national level. We try to reduce the number of works coming from different places, and this requires a lot of creative work, because sometimes we can find replacement work. Sometimes we have to just say, well, we're not going to have what we really want and do without what might seem like essential pieces to us. This is a balance which is not easy to find, but we have to keep working on this, because at the end of the day, you have to do a good exhibition with a scientific narrative that makes sense. So it's a bit like sports. People need not to be able to see all the effort that we've put in. And this is something that we work really hard on in about 90% of the exhibitions that our museum produces. So I have no pretensions of exemplarity or of being a good model in this area, because these are things that we've adapted little by little over the years. I know there's still a lot to do, but these are principles that have been taken on board by really the whole team and have become a reference for the way that we work. I might be speaking a bit too quickly, because I know there are people that are still to come, but I just want to talk about 2 examples of the coordination between ways of approaches to our work and research. There's a very radical example with a few pictures here. In 2017, we did a exhibition by Gustav Metzger, who is an artist who is a real pioneer in this relationship between art and ecology. He deliberately produced very few objects. He particularly worked on reactivating works and worked on collective approaches. And with his agreement, I really tried to take his approach, his ethic, if you like, and to take it even further so that it became the very process of the production of the exhibition. What that meant was a retrospective exposition over 1,000 meters squared with virtually no transport, with the reactivation of works on site, with performances developed by art schools in the city. And we also worked with this collective synergy approach by developing a day called Remember Nature, which was a kind of call for projects that was launched in 2015 in London by art school students, so that they could get hold of ecological questions using art. So we really profiled this event. So the exhibition was like a kind of manifesto where we used the ethic of the artist to develop the exhibition. And it was also a way of sharing these ecological issues with the younger generation and passing on the baton to them in terms of their responsibility. And I hope that it at least sowed a small seed for them as they think about their future life as artists. And then in 2018, we had a historical retrospective exhibition called Cosmogonies, and this was for an important artist in our collections who in 1960 started working on their canvases with the rain, snow, and the elements, which developed a kind of poetic approach. So on the basis of this approach, I tried to connect this into the second generation of land art and to connect into a generation of artists who have refused energy processes in their art in order to collaborate and develop a kind of reversibility in their work. For this exhibition, where we had about 80 international artists, we once again had the same restriction. 95% of the loans were from within France. Many of them were local loans, so we worked a great deal on research and looking for works, and we reactivated a number of different works while encouraging a diversity of debate around contemporary ecology. So there's just some very quick examples that I could share with you in terms of how we can try and communicate the diverse debate around ecology today using art, and how we can also use appropriate ways to present these exhibitions and help us to move forward in the way that we design our exhibitions. And it's also a very pragmatic approach, because we've used this word sobriety. It's bringing together eco-design with economic questions, because when we take into account all these different factors, in reality, we're also saving money for our institutions. And I think that can impact a lot of museums and cultural institutions. So perhaps in terms of the little steps that I'm taking, the next ones will be thinking about the building. I work in a city where there's a cultural ambition and an ecological ambition, and we're going to work on a renovation program for the museum, which is going to help us to move forward on the area of the building, making the building, giving it better energy consumption performance. And I'm also working on a scientific and cultural project into which we're trying to integrate this question of eco-design as part of our future project. Thank you very much, Hélène, for this presentation and for your projects and your perspective. I have really picked up this connection between the way of doing things and what we're trying to do, which really defines your project and the presentation of contemporary artists. I think there's a question for you, Hélène. Yes, there's a question from Camille Duret, who's asking about storage of scenography objects. How do you do that? Well, actually, it's a real problem. Our storage areas is just a huge space where we put all these elements together. Now we have pictorial modules that are reused and are constantly in activity within the museum. And then there is a whole range of different things that we use, that we store, stands and perspex cases, but this all means that we need 300 meters squared in addition of storage space. But we also loan this material to other museums in Nice, and we also borrow from other places. So this makes it possible to have less in storage temporarily. Thank you, Hélène. I suggest that we go over now to Sonia Lawson. Sonia, you are the head of the Palais de Lomé, which is an emblematic place in West Africa, and I think you're going to be able to show us some pictures. It's a center in the heart of an 11-hectare site. You want to give back to Lomé its places that have been forbidden to it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you. I'm delighted to be here to talk to you about the Palais de Lomé. I'm really sorry. I would like to share the screen if that's possible. Is it possible to share my screen so I can show you my slides? Yep, it's just coming. Have you got them ready? Here we go. Thank you very much. The Palais de Lomé, Lomé Palace, is a place that is right in the heart of Togo's capital, and it has a park around it. Thanks to this palace, there is a 11-hectare park in the city centre on the coastline, and this is something that is unique in West Africa. We're very delighted to have this, and that determines our strategy in terms of programming our approach to the environment and biodiversity. The palace brings together culture, heritage, and nature. There's activities around visual arts, design, science and technology, live performance, and also a focus on biodiversity. Just very quickly, I'm going to tell you about the location, which was a governor's palace. It's a new all of the aspects of Togo's history, a German governor, then a French governor. This is the venue. When I first encountered it in 2013, it had fallen into disrepair for 20 years in a tropical environment. So you can imagine the damage to the building infrastructure and the way that nature had taken control. We saw nature in all its power, which teaches us as human beings a lot of humility, because trees were growing within the building. Here's a few photos of that. A lot of work was carried out to respect the building itself, but while we were doing this work, we understood that we needed to protect the natural spaces around the building, and these became part of the project, because wherever you looked, nature was all around us. This is a place where nature was on the inside and on the outside, and that was one of the key features of it. Let me tell you a little bit about the exhibitions. A lot of interesting things have been said which kind of resonate with some of the things that we did, not necessarily strategically or deliberately in order to tie in with environmental criteria, but perhaps more because we were convinced of the necessity of anchoring ourselves in the local community. So this exhibition, Togo and Wood, was developed in collaboration with the local communities. This exhibition featured works that were from different communities around the country. They weren't objects from museums, but they were donated or gathered from different local communities. This venue is situated within an urban park, a park within the town, and the project is based around a walk through Togo's countryside. We try to draw visitors into the park in order to discover different ecosystems that are present within Togo. One of the aspects that's felt very important to us, this little hillock is an area which evokes the arid countryside in the north of the country, with a number of different species of cactuses, and this is an artificial relief that was built out of building rubble. So instead of moving the rubble from the site to other parts of the town, we thought it was important from an environmental point of view, almost a spiritual point of view. We wanted to ensure that what belonged to the site stayed on the site. So this little hillock is formed of the building rubble from a little building, a lean-to that was built in the 1970s that wasn't very interesting from an architectural point of view. So the rubble was used to create this terrain, a kind of little hidden surprise within the park. Another important element that we included, again in connection with the local communities, was a whole reflection about the way plants could be used. So this part of the garden focuses on traditional healing plants, so the cola, the cola nut, which is used in Coca-Cola. It's a plant that's found in West Africa, and one of the roots is used as a medicinal plant. So this is an area where we work with traditional doctors, and we use these traditional plants in order to pass on knowledge about these traditional cures. So we want the public to understand the subject, and we want them to discover these medicinal plants. The idea is to create a connection with different peoples and communities, but we also want to create intergenerational solidarity. So to give you an example of what we do, here is an exhibition by a designer. In order to, in presenting the design, we work with the designer's work and create a connection with the park. So these three gourds, these three ceramic gourds, were inspired by the gourds that were found in the nature, and gourds that grow in the park around the palace. So after visiting the design exhibition, we encourage visitors to go out into the park to see the gourds in the park. The same gourds can be used perhaps could be used by a different artist. Here's a work which is based on painted gourds. When we organize events, I'll give you an example. Yesterday, we had the official opening of a new exhibition, and when we were thinking about the things that we would use, we didn't use plastic glasses. We used gourds as drinking vessels, just as they used to be traditionally used. It was a surprise for young inhabitants of Lomé who'd come to the art exhibition, but for the older visitors, they remembered their youth or visits to their grandparents in the village. So it combined traditional and contemporary approaches with an environmental reflection. We were thinking about artists and the way their works could be presented in connection with the subjects they do. Here's a work by an artist called Serge Moumou, who uses recycled plastic and fabrics. He uses traditional bead patterns, and what he's representing here is a sea turtle. One of the things he's very concerned about is the fact that sea animals are dying out. So with our young publics, our young audiences, our school children who come in, we are able to dialogue about what's going on in the marine environment based on the work of art and based on the idea of the ocean, which is just next to where the palace is. Here's another work based on the recycling of Coke cans or Nespresso capsules. So there's always a link. I wanted to highlight the importance of working with local communities. So this wonderful bird that you can see with its dazzling colors is known locally as a choucador. It's one of the 41 species of birds that live in the park, and we invite our visitors to come and see. So we have a bird watching trail, but what we've done is worked with craftspeople, in this case weavers, and we encourage them to use the colors of our local birds as an inspiration. So we recreated the colors of the choucador's feathers in order to create this woven work. So that's a way of connecting with a local community of craft knowledge in order to create this scarf, and it was done in connection with what there is in the park. Here's a little humorous touch. The rubbish bins are made of earthenware with a group of local craftsmen. The local lizards, the Agaba lizards, really like them, and it enables our visitors to discover these lizards in a very fun way. Environmental education is very important to us, so we welcome school parties and help them to discover the riches of nature. We organize activities in the park to help them to learn while they're having fun and discover more about plant species. Another important aspect is storytelling as a form of cultural mediation. So we also work with traditional storytellers. They walk through the park on storytelling trails. They talk about the park and narrate it in song and in story. It's something that the visitors really love because it takes them through the park and gives them a different experience of it. So here's a few of the things that we do here at the Palais de l'Homme. We are really trying to be as consistent and coherent as possible with what's around us, the park and everything that it contains, as well as the sea that is just opposite the palace. We're very lucky to have artists who have been interested in these themes for a long time and who are making things, taking things much further. So we're seeing a lot of input from different artists. So for us, the ecology and the environment is integrated in the plans we've had for the palace right from the outset. It's part of our DNA, and I'm delighted that we can be part of this conversation now and that we're discussing this subject. A few years ago in 2013, I was talking about it with very well-known people from the Parisian art world. I'd say very, very Parisian people in their approach, and they said that ecology and the park and the birds was nothing to do with art, and people wouldn't understand. They would just muddle the message, and it was something that was outside of the world of art. So I'm delighted that this subject is now perceived as being very pertinent and relevant to the work of museums. I don't know if it's something to do with a pandemic or if it's a ongoing underlying reflection which is now starting to come to the fore, but I'm delighted because some people told me that there was no connection. Lots of people said that actually, or they said it very confidently in any case. So this is a conversation that's very interesting because it's relevant for a number of different institutions in Africa and in Europe with different approaches, and it's relevant to local context as well. It's a very exciting subject. Thank you very much, Sonia. Thank you for this presentation. It's very inspiring. I think that you'll see a number of common points with what we're going to hear from Karin Durand. She's going to talk about her storytelling work with the Ethnographic Museum in Geneva the context of her exhibition on environmental injustice, indigenous alternatives. So she talks about this. Karin, over to you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to present a film very quickly in order to present you the exhibition. It's an exhibition which is open at the Ethnocultural Museum of Geneva. It started in September 2021 and runs until August 2022. It focuses on the environment and the climate change, and it's been developed with indigenous people around the world. That was a key point to us. We wanted to have this worldwide view. It's an exhibition that was eco-designed, and I'll talk about it very quickly. This exhibition shows that about 6% of the world is represented by indigenous people, and for many of them, climate change is more than ever a reality. Despite their cultural differences, they share some common concerns regarding the recognition of their collective rights. Evidence shows that when they own and control their lands, the environment and biodiversity are better protected. Many of them share an ethic of care and repair that is implemented on a daily basis, not only to repair objects, but also and especially to take care of rivers, lakes, forests, and oceans. The knowledge and skills that are mobilized and are continually renewed include language, knowledge of plants, and spirituality. Humans and non-human beings have reciprocal responsibilities towards one another. Within this relational perspective, a salmon, a river, a tree, or a mountain are animate partners. Indigenous people claim the important role they can play in finding alternatives to protect natural resources for future generations. When the exhibition showed that when these balances are no longer maintained, the crisis can set in. The ongoing destruction of soils and emissions from unsustainable resource use accelerates the climate crisis, which in turn accelerates damage to the land. Many indigenous people claim that they still live in a colonial type relationship with the states or nations within which they lived. Without prior consultation or consent, these states often prioritize economic development activities such as mining or hydroelectric projects on lands traditionally occupied by indigenous people. This exhibition ends with a time to meet, inviting the public to see, hear, and listen to the testimonies of indigenous experts and artists, and why not, to perhaps get an idea of the need to become stakeholders and actors of change, taking a stand and joining forces, if they so wish, with indigenous people to weave a common future based on the values of care, repair, and responsibility for all forms of life. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you. It was very quick. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. A presentation in 3 minutes. That's really excellent. Thank you. Are there any questions for Karin? Thank you for this wonderful presentation that's really made us think about this encounter and helped us to understand that we are key players in our own change as part of professionals in this community that we form. Any questions for Karin, Estelle, before we come to the end of this wonderful evening? It's almost 9:30. You're still with us, which is really, really wonderful. Thank you. Thank you as well to the interpreters who have accepted to work a bit longer this evening so that our colleagues from abroad can continue to benefit from this evening. Okay, so no questions, but a lot of compliments. Perhaps we could just take any spontaneous questions now, unless Karin, you want to just add something very quickly there. Well, perhaps just one additional thing I could say, having heard the different contributions, I think it was important for us to combine the sustainable approach that we have, and this was something with indigenous peoples, and this is something that we wanted to really commit to in terms of the scenography of this exhibition. It's something we're really committed to the environment. I think that what has been said is really very interesting in terms of these different approaches and also the link to the environment. Perhaps we could hand over to Etienne Bonnet-Condé, because the Museum of Fine Arts in Lille is very active in terms of environmental responsibility, and they're aiming for have high standards in terms of environmental and social standards. And just to round off this evening, it would be really interesting to hear from Etienne about the work that was carried out in the 27th and 28th of January this year within the Fine Arts Museum. Yes, thank you, Hélène and Estelle and Juliette, for this invitation. I'm going to be very quick, but we had about 50 people involved in this question of sustainability and environmental responsibility of museums. We tried to touch on fundamental issues around digital technology, eco-design. There are a number of the speakers that at the event this evening that were very actively involved in what we did. You asked two specific questions in terms of our feedback from this workshop. First of all, were museums ready to move forward in this process, and what do they need? First of all, because we're currently writing the report on this event, we wanted to take the time to properly discuss these issues, and we could, as we read back through what was said, one of the key things is that there is a real desire for action. Of course, we had selected speakers that would speak to this issue, so maybe it was a little biased, but there was a general consensus that we didn't want to just approach this in a theoretical manner, but also in a pragmatic way. We wanted to act and move forward. There was a paradigm shift, a de-escalation, a critical approach to this productivist method, which has really taken museums away from their first calling, their first vocation. And the fact that we are focused on perhaps peripheral issues, we are starting to get a good grip on ways to move forward, which preventing too many loans in terms of our exhibitions, reducing transport. Just to mention eco-design only, but then a number of aspects that could seem fairly restrictive was that there was actually something really creative in this in terms of sustainable development, which helps us to look again in a way that can be quite destabilizing at the very nature of what a museum is, because beyond eco-design is the question of the distribution of powers within the museum, the hierarchy of the forms of works that can be presented, the space taken up by the museum, the inside and the outside of museums, and the relationship with the local area and local communities. It was clear that there was a fairly fundamental shift going on here, which opens up possibilities for creativity. And then there was a discussion about what could be done. There has been a change. We need to return to an initial form in terms of museums, about how we can develop more collective work together and develop more actions together.
Ce soir en très grande partie, c'est que ça
Another aspect that we talked about, which is something that's come up again this evening, is that this opens up a number of different types of solution, which are all very experimental, but also very complementary. There's not a single solution or a single form of action. I think everybody within their site, within their building, have different issues. We don't have the same audiences, we don't have the same context geographically, and there are different forms of solutions that are starting to be developed. And so perhaps just to conclude and respond specifically to this question, what are museums looking for? We really heard a need for support, for greater cultural awareness, for guides in terms of preventive approaches, and also tools for being able to measure the work that we're doing in these areas in terms of our carbon footprints and also in analysis of life cycles. This was something that was important. There's still need to evaluate what we're doing a great deal. So I've tried to be very quick because we've now passed 9:30, so thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to hand back over to our president, Juliette Raoul-Duval. So I'll just say very quickly, thank you very much to everybody. We're running very late, so I'm not going to summarize everything that's been said, but I really want to say thank you to all of our speakers, because you've really met expectations. It's been very specific, very concrete. There have been a number of approaches that have been very forward-looking. I think we've really got to grips with this question, and I'm not summarizing because it's already 9:30 and we don't want to keep people too late, especially those people who are working. Thank you very much to the interpreters who we're going to be able to release in just a few moments. But I think we could otherwise have kept talking much longer, because this debate really could keep going, and I think we will need to keep developing this discussion. We started last summer with a discussion with a small group, and we saw how interested people were. We got a whole number of people interested in this, and lots of people were really interested, and we connected in with the ICOM International Working Group. And actually, there's a great deal to be said with regard to the credibility of museums and sustainable development. We talked about a whole range of subjects and have come to understand that museums have always had a social mandate, but that this is changing. I think that's important to recognize. The health crisis that we've been through, and also the climate crisis that we saw the impact of this summer, makes it very clear that we really do have a role to play, that society is changing, and it's clear that you're all here now as members of the profession wanting to respond and engage with this question. I don't think I have anything else to say in terms of conclusion. Thank you very much again to everyone. Thank you to the interpreters once more. I don't think we have many non-French speaking people here for the moment, so thank you to those of us who are note-taking for us tonight. You know our publications. We publish all of our debates in this collection, and we distribute this broadly because I think it's very interesting. Thank you, Catherine, Joël, and Claude Maurice as well. Thank you to the team who have been listening in to the interpretation so that we can keep a trace of all of this. You can find all of this on the website, perhaps not tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow, perhaps. Hélène, have you got anything to say? I would just remember that a monkey lets go of a branch if it can grab another branch. I think that's what we've done this evening. It's been a wonderful evening. Thank you very much as well to Hélène and Estelle, who are part of the working group with ICOM and have encouraged us to develop this working group. It's not easy to put an action in place as part of an organization like ICOM France, which is already doing lots of things, and it's not always straightforward to do something else. But you were really inspired, and you were right to push us in this direction, and I think you've been proven right tonight. Thank you for Anne-Claude, who has made this evening work. So this is just the beginning. In terms of what's next, our next evening on ethics will be in May on conservation and restoration. It will be a very interesting and inspiring evening, and that we've really been focused on multilingualism in ICOM, and we think that in areas like this, around these areas of sustainable development, Nathalie Bondil has talked to us about care, about putting museums at the heart of society, at the heart of their people's well-being. These questions, of course, go beyond our borders, and that people need to think in their own language. So we need to have a common language for communication, but in the period we're in, we need to think about the future of our museums. And in order to be able to think, we need to be able to draw on a multiple range of languages, because language is the tool for mental construction. So we are wanting to promote what we're doing within ICOM. I also wanted to say thank you to our inspiring president. Thank you so much, Juliette. Have a good evening, everybody. Good evening. Oh, goodbye.